Okay, so we more or less just tell people where we are. We more or less finished the Hakdama of the Rambam. So until the end of this month, I'll be talking about some miscellaneous topics. Hopefully we'll touch upon the Haggadah as well, but until we get to the Haggadah, I just want to mention some things that Nogea the Parsha, which are interesting Yesodos. We know that in Parshas Truma and Tetzaveh, Moshe Rabbeinu was given the commandments about the Mishkan and the Big Day Kahuna. And then in the Kisisa, just continuous, at the end of everything, Moshe Rabbeinu was then told, V'shamru v'nei Yisrael es Shabbos, that the Jewish people should keep Shabbos, l'dorosam bris olam, to be an eternal covenant, and Shabbos is a sign. So you'll notice that the commandment about Shabbos was not given until after the Tzivoyim of Melechas HaMishkan. So first there was a whole discussion of the construction of the Mishkan, and then Hashem says there's a mitzvah called Shabbos. Now, we know that in Parshas Vayakel, when Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the second Luchos, and he came down on Yom Kippur with the second Luchos, and the day after Yom Kippur, he is gathering, Vayakel, he gathers together all of Bnei Yisrael. And he says, Eilah hadvarim, these are the words that God commanded. And he says, 6 days you'll do your work, and on the 7th day you'll keep Shabbos. Do not burn fire on Shabbos, etc. And then he commands them about the Mishkan. So you'll notice the difference in sequence. That when Hashem speaks to Moshe, he first talks about the Mishkan and then gives them the commandment of Shabbos. When Moshe is communicating to Bnei Yisrael, he first tells them about Shabbos and then tells them about Mishkan. So the common denominator is, in both situations, there is a juxtaposition between Shabbos and Mishkan, meaning the two ideas are brought together, but the difference is in what order. So if you look in Rashi, Rashi really does not give you a good answer to this question, because Rashi simply says, identically, in Kisisa and in Vayakel, that the reason why there's a smichus of Shabbos and Mishkan is to teach us that even though there's a mitzvah of building the Mishkan, you are not allowed to build the Mishkan on Shabbos. In other words, Shabbos overrides. So the way you'd interpret the smichus, saying the same thing, in other words, in Kisisa, Hashem gave us Mishkan, and then says, even though I gave you Mishkan, you got to keep Shabbos. In Vayakel, it's saying the same thing in a different way, and that is, before I tell you about Mishkan, I'm going to tell you about Shabbos, because Shabbos is more important. And in fact, as you know, the whole source of what are the 39 malachos that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos is based on the 39 creative activities that were involved. Now, that's not totally true. In other words, let's just think about this for a moment. It's true that there are many, many malachos. The vast majority of the 39 malachos are not mentioned in the Torah at all. If I ask you, where does the Torah say don't write? It doesn't say it. Where does the Torah say don't cook? It doesn't say it. We only know that these are prohibited because these were activities that were involved in the construction of the Mishkan. You'll ask me, how was cooking involved in the construction of the Mishkan? Because they had to cook. They had to boil herbs in order to make the dyes with which they dyed the various curtains of the Mishkan. However, so most of the malachos are simply derived from whatever was done in the Mishkan is what you don't do on Shabbos. That's what the Torah is saying. That even though I gave you a mitzvah of Mishkan, you cannot do this on Shabbos. However, there are some malachos that are mentioned separately. Let's enumerate which malachos are mentioned separately in the Torah. Well, one of them is in Vayakel itself. Lo sivaru eish b'chol moshvosechem. Do not ignite, is how we interpret it, fire in all of your dwelling places on Shabbos. This is the malacha called havara, making a fire. And havara is mentioned separately. Even though havara was used in the Mishkan, the Torah did not rely on the general Mishkan rule to Aser Havara, but rather Havara is mentioned separately. Now, the Gemara itself raises the question, if all of the malachos are forbidden because they were involved in the building of the Mishkan, why does the Torah mention Havara separately? What is the significance of mentioning Havara separately? So we have a machlekes tanoim. Rav Yossi says that the reason the Torah separated out Havara was for a tremendous leniency. That all the malachos of Shabbos, if you do them b'mezid, you're chayav misa. And if you do them b'shogeg, you have to bring a sin offering. Havara is separated out of the category of malacha because it is only a negative commandment. According to Rav Yossi, if I lit fire on Shabbos, I'm over on a lav of lo savaru eish b'chol mashvesechem. I'm not chayav misa, and I'm not chayav a korban chatas. That's Rav Yossi's point. Havara is mentioned separately, lelav yotza. Now we don't paskin like Rav Yossi, we paskin like the Chachamim. And the Chachamim have a different view, and this actually ties into something that some of you may remember last year when we went over at great length, the Yud Gimel Midas, the 13 principles of interpretation of Rabbi Yishmael. Some of you might have fond memories, some of you might have nightmare memories, depending on whether you enjoyed it. But this is actually one of the midas of Rabbi Yishmael is the following. Davar, and if you say this every day in davening, if you say korbanos, davar shahaya bichlal, something that was covered in a general rule, v'yatsa min haklal lelamed, and it was separated out of the general rule to teach me something that I otherwise wouldn't know. Lo lelamed al atzmo yatsa. It is not only coming to teach me something about itself, ela lelamed al haklal kulo yatsa. The specific reason why it is separated out to teach me something, the thing that it's teaching me is not only nogeya itself, but it'll be nogeya the whole klal from which it was emerging. Now, here's the thing. Let's imagine the Torah would not have separated out Havara. All you would have had is a general negative commandment, do not do malacha on Shabbos. And we would know there are 39 things you're not allowed to do. What would be the halacha if on Shabbos I did 39 malachos? I wrote and I cooked and I harvested and I plowed, etc. And I wrote. And I did it b'shogeg. I didn't know, right? So how many sin offerings would I be chayav? So the truth of the matter is you'd only be chayav one sin offering because essentially you did the same aveira 39 times. For example, let's take chaylev. Eating chaylev, a forbidden fat, is a negative commandment for which you're chayav karesh b'mezid, and therefore you're chayav chatas b'shogeg. If I ate a kazayas of chaylev and another kazayas of chaylev and another kazayas of chaylev, I do the same aveira multiple times. Right? This is a very important rule in sin offerings. If I do different aveiros, this is shogeg. I eat chaylev and dam, I bring 2 chatais. If I eat chaylev and chaylev, I bring 1 chatas. Now conceptually, doing malachos on Shabbos is chaylev v'chaylev, because if I cook, what lav am I over on? Loisasa kol malacha. If I write, what lav am I over on? Loisasa kol malacha. If I harvest, what lav am I over on? Loisasa kol malacha. So if I would have done 39 malachas, I was over on loisasa kol malacha 39 times. Under the standard law of chatas, I would only be chayav 1. Now, but since the Torah did mention out fire as a separate negative commandment. So, at a minimum, if I did all 39 malachos, I would be chayav 2 sin offerings. I would be chayav a sin offering for the 38th, and I would be chayav a special sin offering for the prohibition of havara. But since under Rabbi Yishmael's principle, once I'm taught something about the thing that's taken out of the klal, it goes back and reflects on the whole klal. So the same way havara would have its own chiyuv chatos, every one of the malachos of Shabbos will have its own chiyuv chatos. So yeah, it's still true that if I cook and then I cook and then I cook, I'm only chayav 1 chatas. But if I do different malachos, right, this is called lechalek, meaning we consider each malacha to be the equivalent of a different lav. So you understand how this works. In other words, this is based on a combination of the notion that havara being mentioned separately creates a chiluk chatos, but that alone would only have applied to havara. But because of davar sheyatsa min haklal, v'yatsa min haklal l'lamed, lo l'lamed al atzma yatsa, ela l'lamed al haklal kulo yatsa, it's megala that all of them lach. Now, l'maisa, the Mishnah does make a chiluk about this. So the Mishnah makes a chiluk and says that this rule, that for each different malacha of Shabbos, you're chayav a separate chatas, is only if you had a separate shogeg on each of the malachos, meaning the following. If a person thought today was Shabbos was Sunday, and he did the malachos because he thought today was Sunday, that's only one shogeg. So there, even if he did 39 different malachos, he's chayav only 1 chatas. But if he knows that it's Shabbos, but he thinks you're allowed to write, or you're allowed to cook, or whatever it is, that's when we say the rule. Now, the rule of chiluk chatos, that each malacha has its own chiyuv chatos, only applies to what is called zadain Shabbos. He knows that it's Shabbos, and he's a shogeg on the malachos. If, on the other hand, it's a shigagas Shabbos, then in such a situation, I mean, he doesn't know it's Shabbos, he thinks it's Sunday, then indeed, even after the drasha of l'chalek, he is only chayav 1 chatas. Yeah.
Does Rabbi Yishmael's rule only apply when there's a pasuk afterwards to reintegrate the prop?
No, it basically means you had a klal. This is mentioned separately. It's megala on the klal. I mean, there must have been a klal, but the klal could have been before. You didn't need a reintegration for that.
Okay, so there's no way to separate something out of a klal to give it its own special.
Well, it's complicated because this is one of the big questions here, because there's another midah of Rabbi Yishmael, that when the thing that is taken out of the klal is teaching me a chiddush that was not a totally new thing, then I don't bring it back to the klal. So the question becomes, well, by definition, everything that's yatsa min klal is coming to teach me a chiddush. But the answer would be, it depends on how it's stated. Meaning, lo yisavaru eish b'chol moshvosechem is not stating a chiddush, because in terms of what it states, it simply says, not allowed to make fire. I would have known that. So it is repeating what I would have known from the klal, coming to teach me a new thing. As opposed to, let's say it would have said an explicitly new thing, then I wouldn't have brought it back to the klal. Right? That's the difference in the rules. Do you want to say, Yaakov, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if the malachas of Shabbos are more important than the building of the Mishkan, then why is the avoda in the Mishkan docha Shabbos?
Right. We'll come to that. That's a very good question. It is very, very true that and again we'll talk about this, that it is only the building of the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash that does not override Shabbos. But Shabbos in the Beis Hamikdash, you'd be very amazed, right? If some of the people who demonstrate in Bar Ilan or whatever would come into the Beis HaMikdash, they might start throwing stones. You walk into the Beis HaMikdash, animals are shechted, and fires are made, and meat is cooked, and the korban tamid is brought, and the menorah is lit, and the ketoris is burnt. Mamish, all of the Chol Shabbos. Now, of course, you understand that not everything can be done on Shabbos. The only korbanos, or avaida, that can be done on Shabbos, is the avaida of the tzibor, the public offerings, the korban tamid, the korban musaf. If you wanted to bring an olah or a chatas as an individual, you would not be permitted to bring it on Shabbos or even Yom Tov, for that matter. So it's only a korban sibor, and it also has to be a korban sibor that has a definite zman. For example, there are korbanos sibor which are not tied to a specific date. They're pretty rare. Most korbanos sibor have a date they have to be brought on, like the tamid has to be brought every day. The musaf has to be brought on Shabbos. So a korban sibor that has a kavua dikazman even overrides Shabbos. Now, what is an example of a korban sibor that does not have a kavua zman? It's fairly rare. You have to come up with kind of obscure cases. But an example would be par helem davar shel sibor. This is the Maseches Horis is about this. This is where, as a result of an erroneous decision of the Sanhedrin, most of the Jewish people transgressed a commandment of the Torah, for which you're chayiv kares b'mezid. Now, had this not been from a psak beis din, then every person would bring a sin offering, a korban chatas. But because it came via the beis din, meaning the Sanhedrin, instead of individuals bringing a korban chatas, the Sanhedrin, on behalf of the Jewish people, bring a special bull, and that's called a korban sibor, to be mechaper for the sibor. But that's not brought on Shabbos because the Torah does not say a definite date. So that's an example, it's a rare example, of a korban sibor that's not kavua lozman. So for that, you do not bring it on Shabbos. But the vast majority of korbanos sibor, such as the tamid and such as the musaf, is kavua lozman, so it's doch Shabbos. So why? So we'll talk about that. Why there is that difference is a good question, but you're 100% correct. There's certainly that difference. Yeah.
You mentioned that in order to move the territory of being chayav multiple chatas offerings on Shabbos, you have to first of all know it's Shabbos and also think that thing is okay, right? As you mentioned.
Yes. Yes.
So how would let's say switching on a light by accident, would you be chayav chatas there, or?
Well, it depends what you mean by accident. Meaning like this. I mean,
I know it's not allowed.
Be sure you understand that if I push against a wall and accidentally my elbow turns on a light, I do not bring a sin offering for that.
So I go into my room and flick the light, and there's a habit.
Okay, so that's a little tricky. But if you consciously, meaning intended to turn on the light, but you weren't thinking that it was prohibited, meaning you know in your mind it's prohibited, but you weren't like thinking, there was a lapse of your thought, that would be a shogeg, that would be inadvertent, and you would bring a sin offering. But you understand the difference. The difference between walking into the room and unthinkingly turning on a light is different than being pushed against a light switch and it goes on. When it's pushed against the light switch, there was no volition to turn on the light. When I turned on the light, I intended to turn on the light even though I wasn't thinking. So in the latter case, you bring a sin offering. In the former case, that's called a misasek. You do not bring a korban chatas b'chlal. Yeah?
So when things are mentioned multiple times in the Torah, like let's say like basar v'chalal or like not eating insects, if someone does, like insects, I think it's 5 times, right? So if someone does that, are they over 5 lovers? And they do one sin offering, but they still did.
Yeah. So first of all, keep in mind the following. Keep in mind that when you're talking about insects in particular, you're not dealing with sin offerings, because a korban chatas is only brought for aveiros that if you did b'mezid, you're chayiv kares. So the issue about bugs and insects is not a korban chatas. The issue is malchus. That if you violated it b'shogeg, there is no punishment on earth that you get. If you violated b'mezid and you were warned, you could get 39 lashes. Now, the Gemara does say, if you eat different types of insects, you could get 5 times, you're over on 5 lavin, and that actually means, right, each lav is up to 39 malchus. Wow. I remember, I don't know if they still have it, but Singapore used to have caning, meaning you could be hit with a stick for things like littering, right? So don't litter in Singapore. They're very, very strict on that. By the way, if you have marijuana, you can be killed. So, right. But for littering, they have rachamim a little bit. They'll just whip you a while for it. So I think some American kid, spoiled kid, was littered, and he was going to be caned. Now the caning was four hits, and there was whole an international denunciation, the United Nations, barbarity, torture. Well, it's lucky we didn't have the UN in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. I mean, malchus is 39 malchus. Yeah, a doctor will examine you to be sure that if it looks like he's going to kill you, we'll do less than that. But, now, that actually means when we say you're chayav 5 malchus, that's 5 times 39. Pretty bad. Now, the question is this. How do you view the idea that because the Torah says 5 times don't eat insects, apparently you're over on 5 lavin? So the Rambam, this is machlokes, the Rambam and the Ramban. The Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvahs actually says that we don't count repeats of a lav as separate lavin. For example, the Torah says don't eat blood 5 times. We don't say every time I eat blood I'm over on 5 lavin. It's one lav that's repeated 5 times. So the kasha is, if it's only one lav that's repeated 5 times, why would I get 5 malchus? So the Rambam explains the way it works is because each lav is picking up something new that's not covered by the old lav, meaning to say one lav might be referring to one type of blood, another lav is referring to a different, meaning like this. Once you can give a new content to each lav, then even vis-a-vis the overlap, we would look at it as a distinct lav. See what I'm saying? In other words, you have lav 1 that says don't eat land creatures. And lav 2 says don't eat any insects. And lav 3 says don't eat water creatures. And lav 4 says don't eat flying creatures. And then you eat a creature that flies, it's on the water, etc. So each lav is picking up a new thing. That's when you get 5. But if you're just doing the same thing one time through 5 isurim, they're not considered, right? That's what the Rambam says. The Ramban seems to be cholek on that. Okay, someone had a, yeah.
Did the Rambam say that on Shabbos no personal korbans are offered?
That's correct.
So what about if Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos?
Yeah. So here's the thing. The korban Pesach itself is brought on Shabbos, right? That's 100% true, that if Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, people bring the korban Pesach. That means they shecht it. Remember, the Pesach is eaten at night, but they shecht it, and they burn the emurim on the Mizbeach. So the question is, that's a korban Pesach is a korban yachid, really, because each individual family has to bring their own korban Pesach. So based on this, Tosfos actually writes, so I have to correct what I said a little bit, that although I talked about a korban sibor that's kavua lozman, Tosfos says the most important point is kavua lo zaman, even if it's a korban yachid. Now, most korban yachids don't have a definite date. Sin offering, burnt offering. Korban Pesach is kavua lo zman. because you're supposed to bring it on the 14th of Nisan, even though there's Pesach Sheni, but there is a Kviyas of Zman. So Tosfos actually understands that even a Korban Yochid that's Kavua Lo Zman is Docha Shabbos. And as far as I know, the only example of that is Korban Pesach itself.
What about the Chagiga?
No, so the Chagiga is not Kavua Lo Zman. Well, it depends which Chagiga you mean. There are two. Chagiga is a peace offering, a Korban Shlamim, that is brought on a Yom Tif. But with respect to Pesach, there are two Chagigos that are brought. There is a Chagiga that is brought on the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach, and then there's a Chagiga that's brought on the Chag itself. Neither of them are going to be Docha Shabbos. The Chagiga of Yom Tov is not going to be Docha Shabbos, and the reason is because you have 7 days to bring a Chagiga. So, you don't have to bring a Chagiga the first day of Yom Tov. You can bring it any one of Chol HaMoed days. So there's no Kaviyah Saman. So it's a Korban Yochid that's not Kavua Lo Zman. It's not going to be Docha Shabbos. Now the Chagiga of Yodalit is also not Docha Shabbos simply because there really is no Chiyuv to bring such a Chagiga. The purpose of that Chagiga is simply to fill you up, so when you eat the Korban Pesach, you're already full. So if you don't have a Chagiga, you can fill yourself up with other food or whatever it will be. So that's not called a tzorich of a Kaviyas Man. So Chagiga is not Docha. An Olas Riyah is not Docha for the same reason, because you have 7 days to bring it.
What was the Ramban's opinion? Like, does he count more than 613? Which is
Yeah, so that's the problem. So the problem is the Ramban is Mechalek. See, the Rambam has a rule that if you get multiple Malkus, you have to count them separately. The Ramban apparently differentiates between the possibility of Malkus and how you count them. So you don't. So the Ramban certainly does not count them as separate lavin in Taryag, but he says the repetition indicates that they're separate lavin for purposes of punishment. Yeah.
Did he base them give out Malchus in actuality? I know death penalty are very, very rarely did.
Yeah, so as far as I know, yeah. I mean, it's true that the Mishnah says a Sanhedrin that kills somebody every 7 years, and one opinion says 70 years. And Rabbi Akiva said, if I would have been on the Sanhedrin, nobody would ever die. But that seems to be a unique consideration for the death penalty. As far as you know, Malchus was given more frequent. Now remember though, Malchus is also, it's hard to have the conditions that we give Malchus. There have to be 2 witnesses that saw you. They had to warn you. You had to acknowledge the warning. Most of the time, those conditions are not going to be met. So even Malchus would not be an extremely common event, but it did happen apparently. In fact, it's a whole interesting issue, even when the Malchus of the Halacha lapsed, because we didn't have a Sanhedrin, etc., Jewish communities on their own would sometimes have different types of punishments. These are called Horas Shah. These were temporary punishments that Jewish governments would do. Sometimes even death penalties. They sometimes killed people. Not that often, but there were actually capital punishments in the Middle Ages for informers and people like that. Okay, yeah.
Do we know of any particular errors that were sort of popular, I guess, for Malchus, that people were not
it's hard to know. Baruch Hashem, I guess the most popular Averas, you will tend not to get Malchus. So, for example, you don't get Malchus for Lashon Hara. Otherwise, we'd be in a lot of trouble. And the reason is that there's a very important klal for Malchus, a lav she'ein bo ma'aseh, a negative commandment that does not involve action, you don't get Malchus for, and speech is not considered action. So things like Lashon Hara is a lav she'ein bo ma'aseh. Similarly, a related rule is a lav for which there is a monetary penalty. There is no Malchus, because the mammon covers the punishment. An example would be gezela. If I steal, even though I transgress a negative commandment, I don't get Malchus for gezela, because that's nitain L'tashlumin. Now, another example is chovel. I break somebody's arm. Chovel, I damage them. I'm over on a lav. By the way, what lav? What lav am I over on if I hit somebody? Right? So losasa doraisa, to hit somebody in an angry way. Now again, it may only apply if it's a black and blue mark, or you broke a limb, meaning you hit somebody and it didn't make a mark. Maybe you're not over. But you're over on something from Malkus, because the Torah says by Shaliach Beistin, Arba'im Yakenu, the Shaliach Beistin can give up to 40. Now that means up to 40, not 40, meaning 39 Malkus. Lo Yosef, he is not allowed to add anything more. So Chazal take that pasuk, which is really a very specific context of a shaliach beistin, not hitting extra, that this is the lav of every time I hit somebody. I'm over on the lav of lo Yosef. Right? You're taking a lav that was written by a shaliach beistin and you're applying it to everybody. But nevertheless, you don't get malchus for hitting somebody, because the Torah says the punishment is compensation. Now, based on this, the Gemara says a very surprising rule. Since you're only mechuyev to do compensation, if the amount of damage you did was at least a pruta, let's say it's a penny, although it's not exactly a penny. So if you hit somebody and the damage in terms of medical bills and everything else is less than a pruta, you will get malchus. So that creates like very funny incentives. Let's assume, you slap somebody in the face. There's no permanent damage, etc. So it's worth less than a shava pruta. You're going to get 39 malchus. On the other hand, if you break his hands, you'll pay, but you're not going to get the 39 malchus. Now, I don't know, just in terms of pure, hedonistic decision making, I would rather write a check than get 39 malchus, right? So if you hit somebody and it's less than a shava pruta, you'll want to do it a little harder. That way, get it up to a pruta, especially if it's only a pruta, it's not even a lot of money, right? Get it up to a pruta, and then you don't get malchus. If it's less than a pruta, then you're going to be chayiv malchus, right? It's very, very strange. Because it's only when there's a chayiv tashlumin that you don't get malchus. When there's no chayiv tashlumin, there's going to be malchus. Yeah.
What Rabbi just said about what Chazal read out from the pasuk where it says 8 but not more.
Yeah.
39.
Yeah.
Which Mida of Rabbi Yishmael was that an example?
This would be a binyan av. This is taking a rule of the Torah and using it as a general principle, and not just confining it to its specifics. Right? That's a binyan av mikosov echad. A binyan av from one particular source.
And also in the person who hit the other person, let's just say he hit him twice. The first time it was like a left hand, and the second time he broke their hand.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It would really depend on whether we look at it as one maisa, meaning to say, if it was the middle of a fight, we would look at it as one thing. If, on the other hand, he did pachos mishava pruta on Monday, then came back to break his hand, we would look at each maisa separately. It's an interesting question. I don't have a clear raya. What is the time element that would define it as two separate actions? But I think there clearly would be a chiluk between one maisa and two maisim. By the way, this issue of chovel, you're not allowed to wound somebody, you're not allowed to hit somebody, actually comes up, again, this is a digression, it comes up in very modern contexts. Number one, are you allowed to box, right? Let's assume just, recreation, you want to box or fight, or not just boxing, tackle football, basketball, right? Sometimes you block somebody that way. Are these problems of chovel in that sense? What about plastic surgery? The doctor who is kind of, cutting into your face and changing things. Is there an issue of chovel? So it's interesting, Rav Moshe has a tshuva on this. Rav Moshe brings a lashon of the Rambam. When the Rambam defines the word chovel, he says the lav of chovel, there are two gersais, is either derech nitzayon or derech bizayon. It's a question of what the gersa in the Rambam is. But either way, let's look at the translations of this. Nitzayon is in a quarrelsome, hostile way. Ki yinatzu anashim is taken from the Torah when people fight. So the Yisur of Chovel is not the objective hitting of somebody, but it's doing so for the purpose of animosity and hostility. That's Nitzayon. Bizayon is somewhat similar. Bizayon means shame or humiliation. You're doing it to humiliate somebody. So whether the girsa is quarrelsome, or whether the issue, hostility, or whether the issue is humiliation, Rav Moshe points out that any type of chavala, wounding, which is not done for those purposes, let's say plastic surgery, for example, which is done to help a person, they want it, would not be a problem. And the same thing would be true, at least for something like football or the like, that even though there's chovel, but this is chovel as part of a game, part of a recreation, it is not an expression of hostility, hatred, humiliation. Would this apply to boxing, mamish? I think logically it could apply even to boxing because, well, I don't mean the boxing of, the heavyweight champions there where they're trying to kill each other. That's a separate issue. But if it's just relatively low-key boxing, one could argue that it's not called derech and son, although the minhag is that from Yidden don't do that. That much is true. But on the other hand, football, football is a long-established practice in the world of the yeshivas, at least the American yeshivas. I know very, very chashuva people. I remember years ago who are now great Rosh Yeshivas, who are very quite adept on the football field. And the games were sometimes rough. And apparently the issue was because it's a game. We're having a good time. I mean, you have to be careful. I mean, that's true. But we're having a good time. And therefore, in the language of the Rambam, it is not derech nitzayon or derech bizayon. And therefore, it would be mutter. So, chayvel is one of those things where it's not the objective act that's the issue. It is the kavana behind the act that defines it as chovel. Yeah.
What were those other malachos?
Yeah. So the truth of the matter is the only one that for sure is mentioned separately is lo savaru eish. Now, there are others that are mentioned separately, but there's a machlokas what they go into, and they were actually in last week's parsha, where the Torah says bachorish uvakotzir tishbos. This is in Kisisa. You shall refrain from plowing and from harvesting. Now, the reason why I say that that's less clear is there's a machlokas tanoim there. Is that pasuk referring to Shabbos, or is that pasuk referring to Shemitah? Meaning, there is an opinion that says Charish and Kotzir are indeed Shabbos, although I have to say that the Gemara does not say why would they be mentioned separately. Havara, the Gemara gives us a reason. It does not give us a reason for Charish and Kotzir, but there is a Mandi Amr that says it refers to Shabbos, but Rabbi Akiva says not that way. Rabbi Akiva, which we paskin like, says Charish u'v'katzir tishbos is referring to Shemitah. On Shemitah, you're not allowed to plow the land, and you're not allowed to harvest the way you normally harvest. You have to harvest with a shinoi. So that's a machlokas. Now, there's another one that may be mentioned. It says, by the man, this is actually earlier, this is even before Matan Torah, Al yetzei ish mimakomo biyom hashabbos. A person may not leave his place on the day of Shabbos. Now, the problem is, there is a machlokes what that pasuk means. According to one Mandi Omar, That is the Isser of leaving your tent with an object in your hands. In other words, hotza'ah, carrying from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim. If you look at it that way, hotza'ah would be mentioned separately. According to the other opinion, however, this has nothing to do with the 39 malachos. This is referring to Techum Shabbos, meaning do not go more than 2,000 amos from your place, which wouldn't, it's not, Techum Shabbos is not one of the 39 malachos. So the point that I'm making is, Havara is the one malacha that is explicitly separated out. Charish, Katsir, and Hotzah would be a machlokas how to understand those psukim. Now, we do have a story about the Makoshes, the one who gathered wood, but once again, that's a story that singles out a malacha, but not as a negative commandment, meaning that happens to be what he transgressed, but the Torah is not defining it as a separate malacha. So that, I'm not going to count the case of the Makoshesh. Okay, so we didn't get to the question, but we'll get to it tomorrow, and that is, once again, the difference in ordering. Why is Truma, Tetzava, Kisisa, Mishkan is before Shabbos, and in Vayakel, when Moshe is talking, Shabbos is before Mishkan. Okay, yeah.